Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the Tangle podcast and the Tangle YouTube channel. I'm your host, Isaac Saul, and on today's episode, we have a really fascinating guest and, in my opinion, a moving and deeply interesting conversation. We are going to be talking about conversion therapy. Obviously, this issue is not something that I think is directly political. It's certainly not something that's dominating the national news right now. But how this interview came about, and I think the conversation that ensues, is very much in the Tangle ethos. And I'm really excited for you to listen to this podcast or this interview, wherever you're getting this. I had a really interesting time doing it, despite the fact that the topic is really heavy, because I learned a lot. And I heard from somebody who I think is a really special person and a tremendously thoughtful guest. So without much more introduction, I'll just let you guys jump right in. Christopher, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Isaac. Really appreciate it.
So this is sort of an interesting background story, I guess, to this interview, which is, a lot of times I go around looking for people who I want to bring on the podcast or bring on, our YouTube channel and chat with them about, their expertise, what they're working on, whatever their story is. And every now and again, something like this happens where you actually reached out to me as somebody who is familiar with Tangle and just said, I'm working on this thing and I have an interesting story to tell. And then I looked into your background and we sort of had a pre-screening call and I was like, oh, wow, this is a really interesting story. And I immediately wanted to do this interview and chat with you because I thought you had such a unique perspective. So I think maybe for our listeners' sake, we could start there. I would love to hear, if you could just talk a little bit about your background and why we're chatting about conversion therapy today, which is obviously a really difficult and complicated topic. And then why you reached out to me, and how you feel like this ties into Tangle.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Isaac. Yeah, so flattered to be on here. I mean, I'm just a reader, like a Tangle kid. One of my best friends put me onto Tangle. He would forward me the emails, and I'd start reading. I'm like, this is too good. And then, Isaac, you do a good job of the clicking to like get me to start paying. You'll say like, this is a podcast for subscribers only, and then so eventually join and love Tangle. And I think as someone, and we'll talk about this in my experience, but as someone who used to identify as very conservative, but as a gay person, as someone who's very religious, who went through a lot of struggles with my politics, religion, sexuality, coming from a much more conservative position to a more progressive, but still kind of moderate. I kind of went in some ways from one extreme to the other, but then I'm kind of in the middle. So Tangle is just like that kind of fresh thing when I kind of think I'm crazy and I want to see things from both sides of the perspective. And I very much personally know a lot of people, friends, loved ones, colleagues, old coworkers, like that really span the political and religious spectrum. So just love sort of the spirit of Tangle, the writing that you do. And so I reached out and said, I would love to tell my story. And then specifically a project that we're working on, a podcast about the LGBTQ experience, conversion therapy, really hoping that the Tangle audience is that kind of group of people who want to hear sort of that moderate middle side that really tries to like appeal to both sides of a really, really contentious issue.
Yeah, I love it. So I think maybe let's start there with a little bit of your personal story. What I know about you, I think at sort of the top level is that you were a leader in a faith community who was involved in many ways in the practice of conversion therapy and experienced it yourself. And now you are kind of on the other side of that and somebody who is, I think, becoming like an important outspoken voice against conversion therapy. Tell us a little bit about that evolution and that story and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah. So, just the word conversion therapy for a lot of people could be a trigger word, right? Like a lot of words in our political discourse mean something completely different to people on both sides. And our media sort of loves to have two definitions for the same word, and we're almost speaking different languages. So I just say the caveat is yes, I am someone who underwent a decade of conversion therapy, specifically religious. That's most of the context. But I'm not someone against religion, right? I was very religious. I am still very religious. I had a deep reverence for my faith and spirituality as a Catholic. I still do. Right. And so that's just contextually, I just want to say that hopefully I'll tell my story and that will, be clear. But grew up in small town Texas, was very into my faith as a kid. As a kid in small town Texas, it was very evangelical in nature. But also as a Catholic, I really tried to find a way to blend those two. Those are even sometimes in Christianity, two groups of people that can be opposed. But after high school, I was so devoted to my faith and spirituality that I went to be a missionary for a year. And I wasn't international, but I was here. And so when I was a missionary, when I was 18 years old, I was so devoted to my faith, but I first started to come out as gay. And I first told a priest in the context of confession, a Catholic priest. And that's when I first heard very clearly, I'll never forget, when I said that I was gay, I experienced homosexual attractions. The response was from the priest, this is a father wound. And I know that's kind of a weird, niche term and the spirituality, but basically what he was saying on a psychological level is, your LGBTQ, your homosexual experience is because of a broken relationship with your father. And as someone who at the time had a broken relationship with my father, okay, that was like, it really hit me. And so we could dive deeper into that, but to finish my story, that was when I was 18. Fast forward 18 to 28 years old, for 10 years, I passionately basically tried to seek healing, thinking that my homosexual experience was because of my family upbringing and all these things. And in that time, I worked in the church full time. I even sort of worked publicly preaching this position, if that kind of makes sense. I was doing advocacy work to really, in some ways, defend that type of conversion therapy ideology. I was trying to be a Catholic priest at one time. I was in seminary to be a Catholic priest. Catholic priests are celibate. And so for a lot of men and women in the Catholic Church, with your LGBTQ or whatever you want to call it, queer, same-sex attracted, and you don't want to get married to somebody of the opposite sex, becoming a priest or a nun or a brother or entering what we call a consecrated life is often a very natural course, right? To sort of not have a family and dedicate your life to the church because just like that shoe doesn't fit of marrying someone of the opposite sex. So that was a big part of my experience too. So I'll kind of stop there before I get too deep and let you maybe ask me a follow-up question, because I know I could get off on a tangent. So
no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm curious, in your personal experience, what was happening for you during those years? I mean, did you believe that your feelings of same-sex attraction were something that could be healed or that needed to be healed and changed? Or did you view it as I am, at risk of operating in this kind of sin that, is going to eternally condemn me. And so I have to do everything I can to sort of prove that I'm trying not to do that?
I'd say D, all of the above, and so that's what makes this a complicated issue. You often read that conversion therapy or maybe you hear a documentary or something, it can be oversimplified. It's just sort of I went out to this summer camp and they did shock therapy on me. That's not at all what I experienced. I'll just say of course I had a lot of sexual shame and coming out and the idea of being, in a gay marriage or anything like that, my whole world would change. At the time I would lose my job. My family wouldn't have been supportive, and so for a lot of us, and this goes back generations for any marginalized group, if you step out of the norm, everything could fall apart, career, family, socially. So there's obviously just this big, and then, there's this big reason to sort of stick with the mold. And I think a lot of people could relate to that, gay, straight, any kind of racial or economic marginalized people group. But on top of that, like you said, the theological piece of I have eternal damnation, if I follow these desires based on what my faith tradition taught me. So obviously I had a lot of reason to seek a healing, to seek a way out of this. And so one thing I really want to mention about conversion therapy in the debate is, people often will just oversimplify and say, well, it's this manipulative thing where young people are forced to do it by their parents or their religious leaders. But what I want to put out there is that I freely chose it as an adult, 18 years old. A lot of people are victims of it when they're younger. But I freely chose it. So I just want to say that, like, now I was motivated by a lot of religious and cultural and, sort of socio, familial factors. But it was something that I freely chose as an adult. And so this is just obviously a nuanced thing. We can't even fit into a podcast or one article, and we can give some resources to people. But that's just what I want to open up to people, is that conversion therapy is for me, the way I define it, is any ideology or thought process that thinks that sexuality, sexual orientation is sort of a pathology. Like it's something that's wrong with me because of some trauma that happened in my life or some lack of formation that happened in my life. And that doesn't have to be in a therapist's office. That could be, as I heard it, in Catholic confession. It could be a church support group. It could be a podcast. And I could spend the rest of the podcast giving a bunch of links and examples where it's still very rampant and it's out there. But all of those sort of other examples I said that are not therapist office means that you can't really outlaw it, right? Like conversion therapy laws are about limiting the licensure of a therapist in a state. And while that is a valid thing to try to combat by passing laws that sort of ban conversion therapy, 8 out of 10 young people like me receive conversion therapy through religious leaders, through podcasts, through books, through other means that are very much protected under the free speech First Amendment. And that's not going to be outlawed anytime soon because it's free speech.
I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit about the origins of this. I mean, I think one of the things that, in our kind of pre-screening call when we first sort of talked and I heard your story, it felt really important to me from your perspective that you were like, you can't untangle this from the kind of religious element. And I'd be curious to hear about like what we know about the roots of conversion therapy and these attempts. Because as you just sort of alluded to, they happen in different settings. Like this isn't just, people going to a psychologist or psychiatrist,
All of them, right? Really?
Yeah. This isn't just people going to a psychiatrist. It's, it's happening in religious communities. It's happening individually through content people are consuming online, maybe, in private. So what do we know about like where this came from, broadly speaking?
Yeah. I think conversion therapy ideology is what I would call it. And you're right. Psychiatrists, psychologists, sort of all these different people that are really trying to figure out if there's a root to the homosexual experience and how it could be changed. Historically, you go back generations, for all of time, we've been trying to figure out why things are the way they are. And sometimes, traditions historically, whether they're native people or, thousands of years ago, religious people believed that like physical maladies were the result of a spiritual disorder or that sin causes something. Like in Judaism and Christianity, like this older belief that you're sick or there's a physical malady because of some spiritual malady. So that sort of back and forth with like what causes this and how the spiritual and the physical is like a totally understandable question. But like, fast forward to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, as people started coming out of the woodwork and sort of coming out, pre-sexual revolution, coming out as gay, a lot of people really wanted to help LGBTQ people, and those of us that didn't fit into the mold wanted help as well because we were being marginalized and wanted to fit in. So basically, it's like, how do we find it? Well, I guess like Freud, one of the big fathers of psychology, there's a lot of Freudian psychology about your same-sex parent bonding. And I remember in college learning about the Oedipus complex and all these sort of ideas of like how we bond with the parent and what that causes. So you take that, and from there, you have this sort of like theologian philosopher named Elizabeth Moberly. And in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, she basically put together that like, if I'm gay, same-sex intimacy is not the problem, it's actually the solution. So the reason I am gay is because there's some sort of deficit of same-sex bonding and whatever, and I kind of referred to that. What's interesting about her is that it was theoretical for her. It wasn't really research-based, but a lot of religious leaders took it. And then you could find places in Christian scripture or Catholic theology that really like built upon that. But it wasn't researched, right? Like when you actually pushed her on it, she's like, well, we still need to do the research. So then you had an individual named Joseph Nicolosi, and he founded an organization called NARTH. And NARTH stands for the National Association of Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. So then there started to be science behind this. So young people like me would go to Dr. Joseph Nicolosi in the 70s and say, I'm gay, I don't want this. And he would say, okay, there's a way you could heal from this. And then I would become a case study. What's problematic about that is the only people in their case studies were very religious people that had unwanted same-sex attraction, that were terrified that they were going to be eternally damned if they acted on this. And so, yeah, it was scientific, but it was a very niche group of people that, and when you're going to your therapist, like you want to report, you're self-reporting like positive, sort of positive outcomes. And you desperately want those positive outcomes. So a lot of the self-reporting becomes skewed. And back then, and even today, a lot of these stories of healing, I would say the stories of healing I desperately wanted. So if I got sort of closer towards thinking I was heterosexual or healing some form of trauma, I would very much want to self-report that as a sense of hope. So a lot of what you see in the quote unquote science is this sort of narrow self-reporting that I would critique. And I'm critiquing it as someone who's a part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
I mean, it's just like a little bit of a quick dissertation on it. But so basically, that's the scientific-y version. And then you begin to have the ministries, the Christian ministries, and they really run with it. And like I said, conversion therapy isn't in therapist office all the time. So you have this group called Exodus. And Exodus International was an organization founded in 1976. It was informed by therapists, but it was very much led by people like me. People that experienced the homosexual attraction or same-sex attraction, LGBTQ people, who basically in the evangelical movement would get married to somebody of the opposite sex and sort of declare victory. And they would say that I'm healed, I'm changed. And so basically from 1976 until 2001, the Exodus movement was a very powerful, influential group of quote unquote formerly gay, ex-gay people that sort of like, I was gay, but then I had healing and now I'm married to a woman and I'm great. So at its peak, Exodus International had 25 employees, and they were an umbrella organization for more than like 400 different ministries across 17 countries. It was massive. But basically over the years from 1976 to 01, the founders and a lot of the leaders started falling out one by one, whether they were living a double life, whether they really weren't they weren't experiencing healing, or they were watching a lot of people experience depression, anxiety, and suicide. And so finally, by 2001, a lot of the leaders defected. Two of the leaders fell in love with each other and came into a same-sex relationship. One of the leaders was caught at a gay bar, sort of living that double life, and went through a divorce. And all of this is chronicled very clearly in a documentary called Pray Away. Pray Away does an incredible job interviewing all of the former leaders of this movement. So these, again, are people like me that were informed by the pseudoscientific idea that your homosexuality could be changed. And even the leader of Exodus International, after it shut down, apologized and wrote an entire book about the ineffectiveness. The tragedy is that conversion therapy is still popular today. There's still plenty of ways it happens. It happened to me well after this organization shut down. And so that's sort of why I'm here. This is sort of why we're doing this work, is to try to still tell people a lot of us still really believe this idea, and it's very damaging. And thankfully I'm alive today, but there are a lot of lives that are crushed because of this and lives that are lost because of it.
Yeah, the story about Exodus is interesting because when we spoke in our pre-screen call, I sort of posed this question to you that I, was struggling with in some ways, of how do we know that conversion therapy doesn't work? Because it's not something that's like studied really well. And, it's not that I don't believe that conversion therapy doesn't work. Like I do believe that it doesn't work, but I had the question posed to me and I found myself a little bit like ill-equipped to answer it, actually. And so I asked you that question. And I thought it was really interesting that your response was actually to point to this organization as like a great data point for how we know that conversion therapy doesn't work. And you sort of frame that answer as being like a good way to address this, because sometimes the science part of it won't get through to people. And like, this is like a very human, real world example of why we should understand that conversion therapy is ineffective. And so, I just gave away your answer a little bit, but I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about that or meditate on that a little bit. I mean, how we know conversion therapy doesn't work and why you feel like Exodus is a part of that answer.
Yeah. So on a micro level, on an individualized level, it's the stories. It's the leaders of Exodus International. It's the hundreds of people that had their lives destroyed by this that are all part of Facebook groups and support groups, right? It's the documentaries that are out there that really tell the stories. A lot of people say, well, I want to see research. Well, this is what I would say. There is meta research, and I'll give you the stats. But the reason conversion therapy is so powerful for the victims like me is because we read individualized stories, and one story of somebody that said they were healed of their same-sex attraction and are now living in an opposite-sex relationship or living a happy celibate single life, those stories seared in my mind and the mind of my peers who are survivors of this. And so I think in the same way that individualized stories like helped sort of push and promulgate conversion therapy ideology, it also has individualized stories that we need to listen to of the people. That's on a micro level. On a macro level, if anybody has 7 tabs open as they're listening to this podcast, Google conversion therapy and the Trevor Project, and then you'll read a bunch of studies. Google conversion therapy and HRC, which stands for the Human Rights Campaign. If you just Google conversion therapy study, I think you'll find pretty clearly that it's there. But like with a lot of stats, like there's just a lot of arguments, and it's really the heart and the stories and the individual people, I think, that are where the hearts and the minds change. Because in religious circles or in political circles, we just don't believe anything outside of our groupthink. So if I'm a religious person, I don't believe the Trevor Project or the Human Rights Council or the Association of Psychological Sciences, because that's the quote unquote liberal media. Those are the godless liberals, right? I mean, I laugh because I very much believe that for a decade of my adult life. And I was very much against all of the things that I just quoted, right? So I'm not just saying to go to these websites as someone who is only firmly on this side. Like, I've only been sort of out as gay for 4 years. So I've actually been on this side of the debate for less than half of the time that I was on the other side of the debate. And I've never said that out loud till now. So that's like a hashtag Tangle reader sort of thing. Like, I very much relate to the spirit of Tangle because I'm sort of all in that web of being on one side and being on the other.
Yeah, I think this question of the efficacy of conversion therapy and the personal stories that you sort of point to and relate to is actually a really good segue into another part of this conversation I want to have, which was a kind of half of the reason that you reached out to me was to tell me about this project that you were working on, which is a new podcast that's come out that I've been listening to, and I certainly encourage our readers to listen to, called Dear Alana. I want to pause briefly here just to play the trailer of the podcast, and then you and I can talk a little bit about it and some of your work on it.
Yeah, so I'll give a quick intro to the trailer. So basically, Alana Chin and I both underwent conversion therapy. Unfortunately, Alana died by suicide, and a friend of mine that lived my life, that lived Alana's life, basically interviewed Alana's friends and family. And through getting to know Alana's friends and family, found dozens of Alana's journals. And Alana's family gave my friend Simon permission to produce this podcast with her journals. So the trailer that we're about to play is basically words from Alana's journals as a conversion therapy victim, read by a voice actor, mixed in with a quote from Alana's mom and her closest friends and family members. And sort of that trigger warning is like, it's heavy. Because it's someone who lost her life to conversion therapy, but it's a beautiful, beautiful storytelling, even though it's tragic, because it's so tender and it really gets into the softness and it gets outside of the political debate and the scapegoating and the oversimplification into a very intimate telling of Alana's story.
Hi, my name's Alana.
Hello.
It's hard to write just for me.
How are you feeling, Alana?
Great. I feel great. I just want to write down my life in a small journal tucked away somewhere in this world. I was 14 years old. I didn't tell my parents where I was going. I didn't want anyone to know why I loved God so much. I took the bus to see him. He forgave my unspeakable sin. He kept my secret, He knew I did not want to marry a man.
Police are searching for a missing 24-year-old woman.
I didn't know she was attracted to girls. She didn't tell me.
The mother says her daughter first opened up to a priest at her church when she was just 14 years old. However, the church denies any conversion therapy was done.
She didn't tell me. She told him. She confessed to him.
Alana shared this very vulnerable part of herself at a really vulnerable age. I think she couldn't get rid of that belief that she felt like God hated her or that God needed her to change for her to be loved.
So I'm curious maybe to start with you talking a little bit about your work on this project and why it was important for you to be a part of it.
Yeah, so I told a little bit about my story, so I'm just going to dive in a little bit more of my story because Alana Chen, her story and my story, and then the producer of the podcast, Simon, are all very similar. But basically, you know, I heard from a priest in confession at age 18 that my same-sex attraction as a gay person was because of a broken relationship with my father. Alana heard from a Catholic priest much younger, when she was 14 years old, that her same-sex attraction as a lesbian was because of a broken relationship from her mother. Now, both Alana's family and my family were the classic American family with however what dysfunction. But I've gotten to know Alana's family, and they're a beautiful family, and my family is a beautiful family. And over the years, I've healed considerably with my family since I stopped doing conversion therapy. Because basically, when church leaders told me and Alana that our family was the result of our LGBTQ experience, and we had a ton of sexual shame, and we desperately wanted to change it, it rips you away from your family. And if you're a parent, you basically believe, A, I failed my child because they're now gay. B, if they act out on their gay experiences, they're going to hell. Therefore, C, my failure as a parent is the reason for my child's eternal damnation, which is just a wild prospect and extremely damaging. So both Alana and I, her at 14 and me at 18, were really pulled away from our family, and we clung to the church as like a surrogate family. And so instead of talking to our family about our struggles, we talked to church leaders and really dove deep in this idea that our family was the problem. So poor Alana's parents and Alana's siblings really did not know what was going on with Alana or me. On a quick anecdote, bright side, sort of like on a lighter side, Alana and I were like, man, we were the youth group kids and we were so into Ultimate Frisbee. And I know behind Isaac, you chuckle because you have like a Ultimate Frisbee with the Tangle logo on it. And like Ultimate Frisbee is a subculture, y'all. Like it's a cult in a good way, you know? And Alana and I were both Ultimate Frisbee geeks. We were both super involved in youth group. We both worked at summer camp. I wanted to be a priest. Alana wanted to be a nun. And so what happened to me is at 28 years old, by that point, I'd spent $50,000 of my own money on individual therapy, on church retreats, traveling around the country, on these healing retreats and healing experiences. And at my rock bottom, I checked myself into 6 weeks of inpatient psychological treatment. For, at that point, $15,000, I took out a medical loan because I was so convinced that my homosexuality was the result of trauma that I could heal. And I identified as having a sex addiction, because that's a big part of that ideology is, oh, it's a sexual addiction and compulsive behavior that makes you sort of act out on your gay desires. Alana, same thing. She checked herself in to inpatient treatment, and at the time identified as having a sexual addiction because of what the church had sort of helped plant in her. At my rock bottom, I left therapy and I realized, no way, I can't do it. That was sort of my rock bottom and sort of like shimmering light at the end of the tunnel. Is I came out of conversion therapy being like, I've done it all. There's no way this is going to be changed in me. And then I began that process of healing and embracing, and then realized the trauma of a decade of trying to change. Alana as well. Alana left that inpatient treatment realizing and really having a big falling out with the church. Unfortunately for Alana, there was so much trauma for her because it happened at age 14 that her anxiety and depression was just so much more intense because of that PTSD that unfortunately she died a few years later of suicide. And I feel like me and Simon, who made the podcast, are sort of here in her memory today. So Simon at the time was working at Patreon. He had worked at Time Magazine and Google. Simon quit his tech job when he heard this story. he went on sabbatical and he moved to Boulder, Colorado. And he basically spent 2 years with Alana's family and friends and basically created this podcast, living in her footsteps. And Simon and I, and a big group of us that are sort of survivors, like Alana, we're like living in her memory. I got married last year in Colorado, and Alana's mom was there. And one of the readings at my wedding, Simon, the podcast producer, did, and it was one of Alana's favorite songs by Kesha, about a rainbow. And I just say that as like a very personal anecdote, that this stuff is really deep and personal for us, even though it's this meta controversial political issue. It's also deeply personal. And I say that because people need to know on both sides of the political spectrum that the way that Simon did this podcast, he so desperately wanted to appeal to all people in a heartfelt way, that can't be oversimplified issue. And it's not trying to scapegoat the Catholic Church and church leaders and demonize them. Right? It's really trying to tell both sides of the story. The last thing I'll say about the podcast is the challenge is that while Alana's family and friends were all willing to speak, none of the Catholic Church leaders were willing to speak on the podcast. They have all strayed away from controversy. They've strayed away from the possible legal ramifications. And so the church, unfortunately, has been silent in this. And so while the podcast may seem one-sided, that's the choice of church leaders. And those are church leaders that I have deeply loved and respect for years, that I'm very grieved by. So again, this isn't just some, liberals fighting the conservatives. This is those of us really feel like we're tangled up in the middle, trying to tell a true story as best we can.
Yeah. And again, I've listened to a good deal of the podcast. Can't recommend it enough. I mean, it's a hard listen. A lot of it is really hard to listen to, but it's beautifully done. And I think it tells an incredibly potent story that is really valuable to hear. And, sort of related to what you just said about the podcast and, the kind of the absence of the church's voice, which is something that I certainly noticed listening to it and understood, why it's not there. I'm curious how you talk to people who are still in the church, other faith leaders that you have relationships with about this issue, and also how you view them. I mean, I would presume that there's some level of like antagonism or, frustration or anger with them. But I also know that you are, from our conversations, I know that you seem to me to be quite good at holding a lot of these things together at once. So I'd be interested to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So we're talking about conversion therapy specifically, how I relate to people that I very much used to be very close with and believed in a very sort of conservative sense, the traditional view of marriage between a man and a woman, that, same-sex marriage is a sin and is disorder to the family and all this stuff. Now I'm very much on the other side. So there's just a lot of pain and grief there. And I use the word grief because my understanding of grief has just like changed my life. And to me, the ideal of dealing with our grief is like how we cut through political debate. So step outside of conversion therapy, whatever this podcast is going to air, specifically this week, Isaac, we're just exhausted. And I know you're personally exhausted by the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. I would just say like there's a line here between, in both situations, I mean, this tragedy of this war and in this debate on conversion therapy, there are two very, very passionate sides. It's a very complicated issue. There are good people and bad people on both sides. And it just grieves the hell out of us. I mean, I remember how you ended that last newsletter. It's how I would end conversion therapy, of just like, this sucks. There's no easy answer. I'm exhausted. I'm in tears over this. And that's just grief. Like that, literally, like when psychologists could do a better job than me of this, but there's like, grief has all the psychological studies behind it that like, we want to resolve it. We want to get rid of it. And grief could be the loss of somebody. It could be change. It could be misunderstanding, but it's just pain. And so, denial is the first stage of grief. An LGBTQ situation, oh, they're not gay, stay in the closet, you'll change, whatever. It's just denying it, right? Like a lot of us just want to deny what's going on in the Middle East. It's just too overwhelming. And then there's the anger and the sadness. And the anger and sadness just comes in waves. Sometimes it's bubbly waves. Sometimes it's tidal waves. On a week like today, it's a tidal wave and it gets overwhelming. And so then comes the bargaining. The bargaining is the stage after the anger and the sadness. And we just want to oversimplify it. We want We want to put it in pithy political statements so that we don't have to deal with the anger and the sadness and the complication of it. Right. And so I just see a lot of that bargaining and that shortcut every day in the news media and every day in our social media of all of these issues. But I think the last stage of grief that we want to get to is acceptance. And acceptance is not that the pain is not real. It's not that, we're pushing it down or denying it. It's just like sitting in it and realize like we can't newsletter and psychologically study and write and speak and podcast our way out of this shit. Like we just have to deal with it. And to me, reconciliation, compromise, bridge building is basically just two people sitting in the grief of our intense disagreements, of our intense pain, and like learning how to be united in it and not letting the anger and the sadness sort of put us against each other. And so to put a bow on it with the conversion therapy debate, it's me talking to my old conversion therapist on his podcast. And the whole theme was grief. Like, we're just going to sit in this. We're going to debate this, but we're not going to get out of the sadness. We're not going to get out of the grief that like, he's worried that I'm going to hell for all eternity. And my old conversion therapist, he'd probably be upset that I refer to him as that, but I'm also talking about him very positively. He loves me deeply. He cares about me deeply. He wants my well-being, but he believes in his heart of hearts that what I'm doing is wrong, that my sexuality can be healed and integrated in such a way that I don't need to be living the way that I'm living as a married gay man. And I'm certainly grieved that I think that what he's doing is still harming people. And we don't want to sit in that grief. We want to pitch at each other from our different podcasts and our different little political bubbles on whether it's conversion therapy or Israel-Palestine or the national debt or whatever. And Tangle is like heartfelt, like the way that it reads in this politics is often emotional. And that's just something I really relate to. And we just got to sit in our grief.
I'm curious. I mean, it's a really interesting framework for that conversation. And it occurs to me, like hearing you talk about it and talking about this relationship with, your quote unquote old conversion therapist, that you are constantly confronted with, the view of your marriage from the church that you are still in many ways a part of, or whose values you're trying to live by. I'm curious how you hold, your sexuality with the biblical text. I mean, how do you navigate that now? Because I do think there are, I'm a practicing Jew, and I see all the time, like people violating different kinds of scriptural texts and, commands and these kinds of things. And I also can see that, there's a pretty direct, clear line in like the Catholic Church about, homosexuality being a sin. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about that and how you hold those things together.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff, right? Like conversion therapy, suicide, sin, eternal damnation. Like, just to bring it up, sometimes I get so heavy on this stuff. Like, I am married to a man. I am the happiest, healthiest, most integrated I have ever been in my life. And I experience so much joy. And my relationship with my family is so much better. And I find myself being able to live out my gospel values of serving others, helping the poor, helping the marginalized, right? Like telling other people about this idea of universal love for all people, reconciliation, these truths that are, span Christianity and Judaism and the Muslim faith and the Hindu faith and all these, native people's spirituality of oneness and unity. Like, there's so much positivity there. Most of the time when we talk about this publicly, it's pain and it's struggle and it's talking about trauma. But I have to say the good things, because if not, people are like, well, is it really working out for you? Like, how's it been on the other side, So yeah, just the lived experience, right? Like of what a lot of our faith traditions talk about is like, if you live according to God's plan, like there will be thriving. And if you deviate from God's plan, there will be suffering, in a very simple way. Dive a little bit deeper, this idea of like, does the Bible affirm, opposite sex relationships or same sex relationships? Okay. If you read the Bible it doesn't really affirm same-sex relationships. It doesn't talk. It condemns homosexual behavior, but it also, if you really read the history of the Bible, it does not really affirm lifelong monogamy between man and a woman. The norm of the Bible is not a man and a woman married for all time with no divorce. If you really read the history of the Bible, and Jewish tradition, like, men had many wives and concubines, and divorce was natural, and women were property. And so when we go back and cherry pick certain verses to say, look, Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis, like, they were a monogamous lifelong couple. Okay, well, somehow they got it wrong right after that, because pretty much from then on, women were not equal to men. They were treated as property, and all of the ideas around divorce and marriage and everything were women were property of men, and they had no place. And then somewhere, thousands of years down the road, women became equal to men, and then we go through and we cherry pick scripture to say that women are equal to men. So the idea that I am a same-sex person in a marriage cherry picking scripture to make it work for me is the same damn thing that we do with every other thing that we've done as progressive people, right? Like, there are now evangelical churches that let women do way more than they ever did. And so I just I have a lot of, I guess, that's what I call for. It's just like nuance and openness to see that the way that we read a lot of our traditional texts is very, very progressive, very forward thinking, even for the most quote unquote traditional people of today, because the earth evolves, because the universe is changing, because we're always moving forward and progressing. And there is something beautiful about conservatism. Conservatism is about, holding to a tradition. There's something beautiful about carrying on things and not letting go of everything. And there is something dangerous about being so progressive that we leave everything behind. And we sit in the middle of that. And that's like every day in politics, religion, sociology, marriage, is conservatives and progressives sort of pulling against each other and finding out what that means. So long answer to your question, but yeah.
No, well said. I mean, it's very well said. I think the concept of conservation and conservatism is something that is deeply resonant for me, and is one of the big reasons, my own personal politics in, as it relates to like our government and our country and the United States and Tangle, I think regularly come out as so incongruent and mixed up, is because I have a deep attachment to the conservation of many values and traditions and beliefs about our country, and that relate directly to my own personal faith. And I view them as all really beautiful and important. So that's a very, that resonates a lot for me. We're coming up on time here. And I think, like, before we get out of here, as you mentioned, this is a really heavy conversation, and there are a lot of, it's impossible to talk about this without delving into some of the really darker parts of, what you've faced and what you're currently facing. And I guess I would love to leave with like a sort of forward-looking view about, what you think is important right now in this moment. And, I'm sure there are people listening out there who are, both religious and conservative. I'm certain of this on, especially on my podcast, who are hearing this and, like your former conversion therapist, are worried for you. And I'm sure there's also people out there who are maybe gay and in the church and religious who are navigating this the same way you used to. And then I'm sure there's a lot of progressive people out there who want to help your cause and get behind what you're doing, and maybe a big mix of all that and different, priorities. And yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit of just like your forward-looking message to those people and kind of what you hope to see in the future on this issue.
Yeah. So yeah, what can we do? Where to go from here? The first thing is conversion therapy ideology is still very much happening. It's not happening just in therapist offices. It's happening in pop culture, books, podcasts, conversations like this. And it's convincing. So I would say, kind of in the spirit of Tangle, like you give a ton of links, sort of like where to go for here and here. So I guess I'll give like 3 categories. For people that are sort of progressive already and sort of want to say, like, is this still really happening? There's an author called Justin Lee, and he wrote a book called Torn. There's an author called Matthew Vines, and he wrote a book called God and the Gay Christian. There's a handful of books about people like me who are gay, who tried to sort of research the route of conversion therapy ideology and found that it didn't work out. And they've since become same-sex affirming in terms of like marriage to someone of the same sex. That's the sort of progressive one. But I want to speak to like conservatives or more middle of the road moderate. Even if you want to hold to a traditional view that same-sex marriage is not right, and that's not what, let's say, God intended, you could still hold that position and allow LGBTQ people not to pathologize and think that their sexual orientation can be changed. And that view would have saved Alana Chen's life, going back to the podcast. I think Alana Chen and I, had we learned when we were 18 years old, hey, you can't be in a relationship with someone of the same sex, that's a sin, but we're not going to try to like pray or heal away or sort of integrate your same-sex orientation because we could heal from this trauma. People in that space, I think, are just as valid. And so that holds to a sort of quote unquote traditional ethic. And leaders in that space, in the evangelical space, are Preston Sprinkle. He's a writer. There's an organization called Revoice in the evangelical church that allows for LGBTQ people to have a space where they can hold to the traditional teaching, but also have a place where they can have community and sort of come out and be encouraged in their traditional values, not in a way that has a lot of homophobia or fear attached to it. In the Catholic Church, there's an organization called Eden Invitation, who doesn't really promulgate conversion therapy ideology, but still holds to a traditional sexual ethic. And then just to put a bow on it and to, selfishly say that the podcast, Dear Alana podcast, really tries to speak to all of them and bring people into all of them. And so that's just like a litany of resources, but they're all out there, and we just have to do the research. And it's at the end of the day is like the stories, is like really try to listen to the stories on both sides of the conflict and really hear the goodness of each person and where they're coming from and how they're trying to live to the best of their ability, a life that helps and loves and serves others, and judging people through that lens and their everyday lived experience.
Christopher Dowling-Magill, thank you so much for giving us some of your time and telling your story. I find it incredibly moving and persuasive. And I also just think, as you said at the top, it's weirdly enough, it is a story that fits very interestingly into some of the work that we're doing with Tangle. And I think you're really demonstrating how to, make some connections across big gaping divides and bring people together and try to find a better way to talk about stuff that is really difficult and hard and has a lot of pain for a lot of people. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the Dear Alana podcast, which again, encourage everybody to go to. I know that's one of the big things that you want to make sure to put out there. Any other organizations or anything you're involved in, or any ways people can keep up with your work if they're interested?
I think, Google Dear Alana, Google my name, Google Christopher Dowling Gay or Christopher Dowling-Magill Gay, and you'll get like other podcasts that I've been in or whatever. But like I said, please, consider diving deep on this topic, reading about it, and just continually trying to be open and hear the stories of others. But I really appreciate the time on here. Appreciate you listening. It's very sort of flattering. I'm only one person, and I know Tangle's really got a wide reach. So really grateful to everybody out there who's willing to dive into this controversial, oversimplified topic and get tangled up.
Thanks, Christopher. I appreciate the time, man.
Yeah.